Well, of course, the first thing I'd like to do is welcome each of you, and I'm grateful that each of you had a happy Thanksgiving with friends and family. Just a brief recap of what we've covered in the previous 3 weeks, given an overview of where this information has come from during the past 60 years, through the various investigations and legal activities that have taken place. We also did a brief bio of LBJ to understand his obsession with wanting to become president. Mm-hmm. And then 2 weeks ago, did an overview of the crimes that are associated with LBJ, theft and murder. And he is facing, indictment on not on murder, but on the theft crimes, the bribery that he's been taking place since the 30s, for the past 30 years. And the law has finally caught up with him. And through both the Billy Saul Esther scandal, but more specifically, the Bobby Baker scandal. And the media is highly focused on him. And here we are in late 1963, and he has taken refuge at his ranch in Texas. And he is laying out the final details of his effort to avoid justice. So there it is. So let me ask, are there any questions that any of you have before I begin today? Okay, but as always, you can put them in the chat or just say, hey, John, I have a question on what you just said. Don't hesitate to do that, please. All right. So I'll come down and we'll share. And we'll be looking specifically at the conspiracy today and the conspirators. So, and as I've certainly led up to this, this is the famous episode 4. We get into a lot of things in this particular episode here. And we'll begin with this lovely couple here. And as I like to say, here is Lady Macbeth and Lord Macbeth, right there. As noted earlier, he had a lifelong dream to become president, but he realized that his chances of ever winning a national election as a Southerner and as an obstructionist, he was the prime obstructionist to civil rights during the 1950s, were practically nil. But he saw an exception, one exception. He could come in through the side door. And this is how. Every 20 years, the elected president, from Harrison right through FDR, had died in office. And JFK was very much aware of this death cycle that began in 1840 and remained unbroken. And here, of course, is an image of FDR just a few days before his death. And I'm going to ask you, how old do you think FDR is in this photograph here? Any ideas out there?
45, 50.
Oh, not quite. You're close. So he's coming on 62, 63 in this photograph here. And this really is owing to he was a chain smoker. He was 4 packs a day. And he had congestive heart failure that was untreated. He had a Navy doctor, and the way the doctor would treat him, he'd walk into his bedroom at the White House in the second floor up there. He'd come in, hey, Mr. President, how you feeling today? And the president, I feel great. Well, thank you. You're doing well. And he'd walk right out. That was how FDR took his medical exams at that time. And it was only when he went to Yalta to meet with Stalin and with Churchill that the Navy insisted that they send a real doctor with him. And this doctor, determined what his blood pressure was. It was off the charts, and they had to cut him down on cigarettes and some of his foods that he was eating, just to try and keep him alive. But that's FDR. Anyway, JFK, he laughed at that statistic, and he said that's one tradition he intended to break. But unfortunately for him, his selection of LBJ was the very decision that would cause the cycle to continue. And I know it's been on your mind, after much we've said about LBJ, why in the world would he ever choose LBJ as his running mate? Let's take a look at that. Here is LBJ campaigning. He actually did make an effort to run on his own name. Love those signs. Welcome, Linda. Come on in. Jump with Johnson. Those are these nice handmade signs. Huh? But when the opportunity to run for president arrived in 1960, he ran the shortest campaign of any candidate in history. He announced his candidacy 5 days before the Democratic National Convention commenced here in Los Angeles. Don't you wish they would do that today? Instead, we start 2 years or more on this campaigning. And here's LBJ. Here he is with his Stetson. I must be campaigning because I'm waving my Stetson. But this is not to say that LBJ was without a campaign. Rather, he waged his entire presidential endeavor on the turf that he knew best, which was the corridors of the Capitol. He was getting to all these other electeds and making sure that they threw their support toward him. And I'll mention this. At this time, there were only a handful of states that had open primaries. Now, I don't know if Arkansas had an open primary at this time, or if the candidates' electors were chosen by the state legislature. Here in California, we've had an open primary since the mid-19th century, so it's pretty familiar to us out here. With Bobby Baker's assistance, Johnson had total control over the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, and through this, all funds were doled out to senators for their respective campaigns in whatever manner that LBJ determined was appropriate. And as it happened, most of these funds were showing up in states where LBJ thought he had the greatest hopes for gaining delegates. So LBJ was trying to buy his way into the convention. And of course, here is our famous shot I showed 2 weeks ago of Bobby Baker with the Capitol in the background. Now, 1 month before the convention, the polls were showing that Kennedy had 620 convention delegates. Johnson, not too far behind, he had 510, so his efforts of buying votes was not too bad. But whoever was going to win needed 761. Now, LBJ thought he might have a chance to stop JFK on the first ballot. And if he could do that, he could peel away votes from him and perhaps some of the other people who were on the ballot. And among them, Hubert Humphrey was there, Adlai Stevenson, Stuart Symington, and I believe there's one other gentleman whose name was in contention for the nomination. So if he could manage to prevent that first vote from going through, he would peel away. But look what happened here in the midst of this. LBJ was running a negative campaign against JFK, having purloined, that's a nice word for having stolen JFK's medical records with help from his friend J. Edgar Hoover, his neighbor right across the street, his neighbor of 19 years. LBJ directed John Connally. See, LBJ's not going to do this. He's going to go have his best boy, John Connally, spread the rumors about Kennedy's health. And Connally dutifully did that. you know, Mr. Kennedy, he's a very sick man. He has Addison's disease. And not many people knew that. And that could be pretty damaging. This image we see of JFK here using crutches is not often shown. But at the convention, on the very first roll call, Kennedy swept to victory. He got the number of electoral votes that he needed. But the Texas delegation, while everybody got up on their feet and was hooping and hollering, Texas just sat stunned and grim. And then there was a motion from the floor to make the nomination unanimous. Only one Texan's hand was seen to go up among the whole delegation until that uproar was continuing to go on in the convention hall. And at last, Connally stood up, turned, nodded to the delegates behind him, and then as one, they all grudgingly got up and gave a unanimous support to Kennedy. so I guess you knew where Texas was at, huh? At the convention. So let's get into it. LBJ blackmails JFK. He arrived at the convention just 4 days before his campaign went down in flames. But instead of licking his wounds, LBJ set about to blackmail Kennedy in order to force his way onto the ticket, coming in through the side door. But this begs the question of why a person who was one of the most powerful people in government, and arguably as Senate Majority Leader, LBJ was the second most powerful person in the United States at this time. Because in the words of FDR's vice president, someone who we often don't think of, John Nance Garner, he said of that role, "It ain't worth a bucket of warm piss." I love this. I love this image here of John Nance Garner. He had it down, didn't he? LBJ, however, he knew the historical record of presidents who died in office either by disease, illness, or assassination. And he remarked to a few of his associates, "You know, I'm a gambling man, and I like them odds." The problem, however, was that JFK, he had no intention of offering LBJ his share of the ticket. He favored Stuart Symington of Missouri. This was the Southerner that JFK had selected. In fact, he had offered the nomination to Symington, who was already at work on his acceptance speech for the following day. However, on the night of his nomination, that is June 13th, 1960, JFK received a call from three major players in the Democratic Party. Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House, we see in the center here. Thomas Corcoran in the bottom left, Tommy the Cork. He was a fixer for FDR. And Philip Graham in the upper right there, he's the publisher of a small newspaper known as the Washington Post. At this meeting, the three men made the case for JFK to select LBJ as his VP. And it's all on this thing here. Johnson could deliver Texas, and you're going to need those 24 electoral votes coming out of Texas. Well, JFK informed his guests, you know, "Thanks for coming by," but Johnson was never in consideration. And guess what? I've already offered the position to Symington. So these three guys went away empty-handed. But no sooner had they left than JFK received another phone call. And this one is coming from LBJ himself. And he's requesting a face-to-face with Kennedy. He's got want to put his persuasion skills to the test. Now, this request is coming in the middle of JFK trying to write his own acceptance speech. But when LBJ arrived at Kennedy's room, this is at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles here, it's right in downtown LA across from Pershing Square. He had the Speaker of the House with him, who was just there, Sam Rayburn. Now, I'll add here, Sam Rayburn did not like John F. Kennedy at all. Thought he was an inappropriate choice to be here, and he couldn't see why Johnson ever wanted to share a ticket with him. But Johnson said, I want you to come to this meeting with me. So we went along again. At this meeting, LBJ revealed to Kennedy that much of the negative information that J. Edgar Hoover had been collecting on him during the past years was about to come out. Now, this isn't me, this isn't me, Senator Kennedy. This is, I'm getting this from J. Edgar Hoover. If you don't choose me as your running mate, Hoover is going to release all this information about all your sexual impropriety for the past years, and that's going to potentially destroy your campaign. So what do you think? Should you choose me or just see your whole thing go down in flames? Well, Kennedy, he understood immediately that he had no choice. He was being blackmailed by Johnson. With no alternative, JFK agreed to offer the running mate position to LBJ. Now, it's just the three of them there, Rayburn, Johnson, and Kennedy. But when they left, JFK calls up his brother Robert, and he says, I've done this. And Robert could not believe what had happened. Why didn't you have me there with you? And Robert immediately, he tries to get to LBJ and dissuade him from accepting this offer. Because he, along with many other Democratic leaders, loathed Johnson. He said, just like those guys from the State Teachers College, they didn't dislike Johnson, they despised Johnson. But, JFK, he's trying to make the best of a bad situation. If I choose him, there's some benefit to this. I go back to me. I should back up here because I know right here I went off onto something I want to get to a little bit earlier. Every time RFK, tried to, and he went to him 3 times, turn down this offer from my brother, just turn it down. And every time LBJ would say, come on, Bobby, how can I turn your brother down? He wants me to help him. And of course, the chance of being at number 2 here was just everything that he's been looking for. It's the only way he's going to get inside. And this is going to lead to the corrupt election. I raised this, of course, a couple of weeks ago, and this raised some questions, but let's look at it in detail here. The majority of this corruption occurred in 2 states, Illinois and Texas. Now, I want you to look at this electoral map from 1960. Texas, as I said, has 24 electoral votes. Illinois has 27. Without those 2 states, if they go to Nixon, he becomes president. So that's what they work on. They work on Illinois, and specifically, they work on Cook County. The Chicago Tribune, in the aftermath of the election, described the voting irregularities in this manner. The election of November 8th was characterized by such gross and palpable fraud as to justify the conclusion that Nixon was deprived of victory. And let's look at it in a little more detail here. In one place alone, one precinct alone in Cook County, 100 votes were cast before the polls even opened. In another precinct, 71 votes were cast by people given false names, while 34 others voted twice. That's why that famous phrase, vote early and vote often. And the Chicago Tribune went on to write, residents of Chicago flop houses were hauled in to vote. The names of absent or dead voters. the machine of Mayor Richard Daley in Chicago, with the assistance of Sam Giancana and his organization, they manufactured 10,000 additional votes, mostly from people who were dead. But this allowed the Democrats to offset their losses downstate, and they won statewide by 8,500 votes. That's a pretty slim margin in a presidential election, but it was enough here. And of course, in this photograph I'm showing here is Mayor Richard Daley with JFK. The fraud was much grander in the state of Texas. You know, everything is bigger in Texas, where a minimum of 100,000 votes tallied for the Kennedy-Johnson ticket never existed to begin with. Yet, despite all of this, the ticket finally carried Texas by a slim margin of 46,000 votes. So even with that theft, they almost lost it in Texas. In one Texas precinct, there were 86 total voters receiving ballots, yet the number cast was 171. And of those, Nixon got 24 and Kennedy got 147. And this pattern of corruption was repeated all across the state. One county which voted Nixon over Kennedy, 458 to 350, 182 ballots were declared void at the discretion of the judges. I guess they thought those chads were just hanging out there a little too far. But where the tally was 68 to 1 for Kennedy, not a single ballot was declared void. That's how you win elections, folks. Richard Nixon was so magnanimous in defeat, unusually so, we have to say, despite knowing of the many irregularities, that's a nice word, isn't it? He refused to challenge the results and even asked the New York Herald Tribune newspaper to cancel the remainder of its critical series. Our country can't afford the agony of a constitutional crisis. And so there it was. So LBJ receives his warm bucket of piss. He had worked hard to put himself into line of succession for the presidency, but once there, he became frustrated and demoralized. And to his great disappointment, he no longer held any sway in the Senate. He had the illusion that he could walk out of the Senate as Senate Majority Leader, maybe win this role as Vice President, and he'd still be able to control the Senate as proxy with the new Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield of Montana. But he learned in short order that no one was going to allow that. Once Johnson was gone, all the other senators were happy to see him go. And look at that face on that image here, that, you know, him sitting is in the Senate there as vice president. He don't look happy, does he? In addition, nobody in the White House wanted his involvement. I think I've mentioned this before. To the Harvard whiz kids, LBJ was known as Uncle Rufus Cornpone. Early on, JFK thought that his vice president, you know, because he's such a good persuader, he could be helpful in passing legislation in certainly the Senate, if not the House. But he quickly realized that once out of power, LBJ was ineffectual. Isn't that the thing? You know, all these politicians, you know, they regard themselves so powerful when they're in office, and they think they're going to carry that when they step out. And the moment they do, it's like somebody turned off the light. And that's what happened with Johnson. In fact, LBJ seemed to frustrate Kennedy's domestic legislative agenda and his foreign policy initiatives, especially in Vietnam. We discussed that earlier. As noted, JFK dealt with Johnson by sending him out of the country as often as possible on diplomatic trips. During the course of these 3 years of the Kennedy administration, Johnson will take 20 foreign trips, and he didn't want to be on any of them. He loathed these duties, but he had no choice. So he would just pack his booze and his bed on Air Force Two, and away he went. As he looked ahead, however, Johnson could not bear the thought of 4 additional years of this kind of treatment in a second term. He must have thought, listen, something's going to happen to JFK, maybe he's just going to die in office and I'll be able to walk right into the Oval Office, But here it is, now 3 years into the administration, and JFK looks like he's getting stronger every day. And I'm stuck out here doing these foreign trips to God knows where. Furthermore, as 64 approached, LBJ's place in a second term is starting to grow doubtful. As I've mentioned, the Billy Saul Estes scandal of 1960 badly wounded LBJ, got him to where, I don't know no Billy Saul Estes. Never heard of him. And then, of course, the Bobby Baker scandal of 1963. He couldn't deny this relationship, hard as he tried. And this one put an unwelcome spotlight on him. And it looked as if he was going to be indicted and convicted of numerous crimes. He was going to the big house. Now, the president and the attorney general were very well aware of these scandals, did not want them affecting what looked to be a sure win in the upcoming election. Now, when Kennedy first came into office, of course, his popularity in the polls took a downturn. But come 1962, when a number of his domestic policies, particularly when it regards the economy, began to take effect, he began to have this continued rise in popularity among the American electorate. And especially since the leading Republican candidate for 1964 appeared to be not the moderate of Nelson Rockefeller, but rather the very conservative Barry Goldwater of Arizona. That matchup just put almost an assured re-election for JFK. However, with the aim of getting LBJ out of the way earlier so that they didn't face these scandals, even to harm this kind of in-the-bag election, they began to feed incriminating evidence about him to the Senate committees, as we had talked about, Senate Rules Committee, Government Operations, as well as to the media, in particular, Life magazine and Time magazine. But Johnson was no fool. He knew who leaked this information, and he knew where it would lead. Remember, this guy has been at the Capitol since the 30s. He studied the history of all of his predecessors. He knew where they went wrong. He tried to prevent that for himself, but the long arm of justice has finally caught up with him. But to avoid an indictment and a conviction, and to achieve his lifelong obsession, LBJ resolved that he had to get rid of Kennedy, and he had to assume the presidency for himself. That is the only way he's going to escape destiny. In the office of presidency, he would be invincible. So this brings up a question here. Who wants Kennedy dead? Who wants him dead? Well, the list is long. We'll start here. I'll go back to the beginning, the desire by higher authorities to get rid of JFK may have begun as early as April 61, the fiasco at Bay of Pigs. Of course, blaming JFK for this was unwarranted. The CIA plotters, Allen Dulles, shown there in the photograph, they knew from the outset that this initiative was insufficient. It was always going to be a failure. But they intended to use the unfolding disaster on the beach to pressure the new president into marshaling a U.S. military invasion. Another issue that was on some people's minds in the fall of 1961, when tensions mounted in Berlin during the construction of a wall preventing the movement of people from the Soviet-controlled area of the city to the Allied-controlled area of the city, the president made more enemies when he deftly stopped the U.S. commander on the scene from provoking a confrontation. And that's quite a story in itself, but won't get into it here today. But JFK managed to calm that situation down, as well as I will mention the Checkpoint Charlie crisis in August of 1961. In April of 1962, JFK faced down leaders of the steel industry, forced them to revoke their destabilizing price increase. He made more enemies in corporate America. In particular, his effort to end the oil depletion allowance prompted a group of Texas oilmen to solicit among themselves vast sums of money to get rid of that bastard. They didn't want to lose those hundreds of millions of dollars of tax-free money that they'd been getting. And of course, organized crime, they're not too happy either. Look at this photograph here. Of course, I think you recognize RFK to the left, and in the center there is former labor leader Jimmy Hoffa of the Teamsters. Having spent a lot of money to elect JFK on behalf of their relationship with his father, they felt betrayed as JFK did not restore Cuba to them. You know, Cuba, Havana in particular, that's the source of gambling, narcotics, and prostitution money. They had money rolling in from those three activities, and it all came to an end with Castro. On top of that, RFK is driving them out of the country. Carlos Marcello, he was picked up and dropped in the jungles of Central America by RFK. He didn't think that was too happy. And then, of course, October 62, when JFK resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis without a nuclear weapons attack against Cuba and the Soviet Union, he made more enemies among the military elites who sought to win the Cold War at any cost. As long as there's two of us to one of them, we will have won. Further, and man, like I say, the list just is going on and on here. When the CIA chief of counterintelligence, James Angleton, discovered that the president had a back channel with both Khrushchev and Castro to resolve crises, he lobbied others within the military and intelligence community to view this as traitorous. He's a traitor. And this warrants executive action because we have to ensure national security. And this is exactly how they saw him. Kennedy, Castro, and Khrushchev. They're all brothers in arms, and we have to get rid of them. For those in the Cold War establishment, a lot of these in academia in particular, who were not already viewing JFK as a threat, his speech at American University in June of 1963, and if you've never read or listened to this speech, it is a marvelous speech, and it really outlines of where his administration would have gone had he not been murdered. He was advocating a limitation of nuclear arms and a relationship of coexistence with the Soviet Union. This was his call to action in June of '63. the American University speech. But if all of that wasn't enough, JFK had issued NSAM 263, that's National Security Action Memorandum, which ordered that while the US would provide military assistance to South Vietnam, there would be no American combat troops sent to fight that war. In fact, 1,000 advisors were slated to return by the end of 1963, and all advisors were slated to be out by 1965. He just didn't announce this publicly. He wanted to wait until after the 64 election because he knew how despised many people would view him for this decision. But fundamentally, JFK had decided, I'm not going to give the generals and the admirals the 10-year war that they are looking for. And as I like to say here, given all of that, who doesn't want JFK dead? Well, in addition to everything above there were some powerful people hiding in plain sight. And these are members of this innocuous business council. Now, this business council is still in existence to today. And of course, members of the Council on Foreign Relations. It sounds like a government body, doesn't it? But this is a private entity that is still very much with us today. And the people that served and the interests that are served by these two entities are the ones that want to see JFK gone. A lot of them are major shareholders of the Chase Manhattan Bank and other major shareholding corporations. Why? Because JFK changed the game. He changed the tax code. Instead of giving tax breaks to all of those banks, as they'd been getting through the Eisenhower administration, he was changing the tax code so that benefit would go to new corporations that were focused on innovation, on technology, and education. And this was not the insurance companies and the banks and the real estate holding trusts and the oil corporations. He was envisioning a new America. As you'll remember, one of his major programs at this time was the space program, and that was being driven by new and innovative technology companies. The other thing about JFK, he was ending the neo-colonial policies that had been in place since the end of World War II. Policies had been pursued by corporations. And when I say neo-colonials, we don't go over and colonize these places anymore, but we have a new method. We go over there and we find out who's running the show, and we say, this is what we want from you, and this is what we're willing to pay. And if that person or persons don't give it to us, we send over the jackals. And the jackals eliminate that leader, and we help to install a leader who will give us what we want at the price we want. And that ought all come to an end under JFK. It was thriving under Eisenhower, but it came to an end under JFK. So for these powerful forces that controlled our nation then, and as I'd say, who control our nation today, who will serve our interests? If we get rid of this guy, who's going to step in and give us what we want? And the answer was obvious, and it had been for a long time. Mr. Crime right here, huh? LBJ simply needed to connect with these people and these entities and assure them that things would be different in a Johnson administration, as they were, because with JFK's death, everything went right back to the way business had been done. Anyway, that's what Johnson had begun to do in 1963 as the noose around his neck began to tighten with these various scandals. He let everybody know, if I was president, you wouldn't be having these problems. Anyway, that brings us to LBJ and his conspirators. This is a nice place to take a little break right here. So let me come up into here and see how you're doing with that information. If you need to step away, go do so. We'll be here, and then we'll resume in about 5 minutes or so. But if anybody has any questions, please voice them.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Margaret.
I don't understand why Kennedy, when he was being pressured to put Johnson on the ticket, why he didn't call his father or brother, who were known associates of the mafia and had all those connections, to stop it if he had already picked Symington. Like, why did he not, since he had used them in the past, why did he not now?
I think simply, Margaret, because the pressure wasn't coming from organized crime. His brother wouldn't have been any help with organized crime. His father would have been very helpful with organized crime. But the pressure is coming from J. Edgar Hoover. JFK was a sex addict, and he was very flagrant with his relationships with women. And the FBI was only too happy to document all of these relationships over the course of his career. And they had this information. They had used it earlier, and they'll use it again against him. And when Johnson brought it forward, he's saying, look, it's not me, Senator. This is coming from J. Edgar Hoover. He's going to release this. I'm your only way out. Why he didn't bring his brother into it, I think because he knew his brother would say, don't do it. And then where that's going to leave him. This was a deal that he could not refuse. They had him trapped in a corner, and he could not get out. Because when he did tell his brother argued with him vociferously, and then went off and argued vociferously with LBJ. And LBJ wasn't going to back away at all. He got exactly what he wanted from his.
So they didn't have influence then. You're saying his dad and brother didn't have any influence over Hoover.
No, Hoover and Johnson and Hoover had JFK trapped. The thing that was so surprising to Rayburn in particular is he would say to Johnson, because he was a mentor to Johnson, I don't understand why you want this office. Why do you want to be vice president? Kennedy's going to lose. You're going to jeopardize your place in the Senate. Why do you want this? And Johnson said, just go with me to this meeting and you'll see what happens. And it went, and he brought forward all this information to essentially blackmail Kennedy.
Yeah.
Now, I'll say this also. Now, Hoover had his own motives in this. We've already seen to some degree, or we will see come 1963. Hoover is looking to when he turns 65 and there's mandatory retirement. He doesn't want to retire. He wants to die in that office. He wants to have a friend in there advocating for him to override the mandatory retirement so that he can continue to be director of the FBI. So Hoover's getting something out of it himself.
Okay.
John, it's Butch.
Hey, Butch.
I don't know if am I on the screen here?
You're not on the screen, but go
Doesn't
ahead,
matter.
brother.
Yeah. So when you said the Business Council and the Council on Foreign Relations and a lot of guys from Chase Manhattan Bank,
Yeah.
that sounds like a name I've heard before. Could it be the Bilderbergers?
I think the big name for us are the Rockefellers and the Morgans and the Chase families, because these are the people that have so many assets that are held within these entities. Now, of course, they work through they use their philanthropic dollars to create these entities, and then they use them to influence both domestic and foreign policy for the U.S. here, to steer them in a direction that's going to be beneficial for themselves. And the big thing that Kennedy is going to bring about is a change in the tax code, that they are no longer going to be able to get these tremendous tax write-offs that they've been experiencing. And they want that to continue. I'm not able to speak directly to the Bilderbergers on this time, Butch, but I'll, if I get to that when I am in with you next week, be able to answer that.
Well,
more.
your description of these entities sounds exactly what people today say is a group of high-powered people, not just in the US, but around the world, who apparently control the efforts. And this is deep state, I guess, really conspiracy theory, is that this group of Bilderbergers that Clinton has gone to meetings with, apparently controls the main direction of world powers. I mean, and it sounded like, and they were around back then, and I think they're still around today, if you believe that stuff.
Well, Butch, I do think, I mean, I contend that those powers that be in 1963 and in 1960 are still with us today. Now, they're what C. Wright Mills would call the rich out of sight. But they have so much power, it just is enormous. We don't even see the hand of their power. But when they move, and they move through, delegates, they control a great deal of, not only our nation, but the European nation and the Asian economies as well.
Yeah, like Soros and Koch and names of European and Asian and people that I don't know about, but they're the rich and out of sight.
Right, the rich and out of sight.
Okay. And the other thing I was going to ask was, how do you square LBJ's really inhumane and fraudulent efforts towards getting in the House or getting in the presidency, and yet his in that third book, The Master of the Senate, how he pushed through the Civil Rights Act in, I think, 64 or 5, I guess. Something that he should not have done because he was a total bigot, and yet he pushed it through. I don't get it.
I think he saw himself, once he assumed the throne, then he could begin to do the kinds of things that would enshrine himself within the American story. He indeed, used up a lot of his political capital pushing both the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act, and I dare say, pushing through Medicare as well. But he had achieved everything that he had wanted by assuming this office, and he wanted to establish a legacy that might compare to his hero, which was FDR.
Yeah,
And
including the electrification of rural electrification.
right.
Things that you wouldn't expect from him.
Right. Once he had power, he said, I can be magnanimous. But he was, he was a murdering thief until he got to that place. But once he had achieved it, he had this, parts of him, and he was able to, we bring the Senate along with him. And I dare say the House as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, Butch. Anybody else?
Hey, John, it's Bob Rodwiller. Butch brought up a good question or a good point about the Bilderbergers, but a lot of the financial families in the world And you mentioned a few, but the ones that you missed was the Rothschilds.
Right, and
And so the other question I have for you is didn't they have a lot of influence throughout the years, and they still do today? But also, didn't President Kennedy he was really adamantly opposed to the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, and his tax programs that he wanted to put forth. And didn't he also want to go back on a gold standard?
well, we were still on the gold
But I
standard.
mean, he knew they was talking to take it off so they could have.
He was right. The one thing that Kennedy was going to do, he had done, he had sidestepped the Federal Reserve Bank by the issuance. I don't know, I want to say it was either 1 billion or $10 billion that he infused into the economy. And it came directly from the US Treasury, instead of having it being issued by the Federal Reserve, where there would be interest being paid on that money. And, they did that. The people that are used to making that money, they didn't like that. And they could see where he was going, that he would have potentially eliminated the Federal Reserve Bank. And the US Treasury, because we are a sovereign nation, we have the ability to print as much money as we want to. And he did that.
We do. Yeah, wasn't that what frightened a lot of people in the financial markets?
Absolutely. And that's why I say these are the people hiding in plain sight who want this guy gone. So we can talk about Allen Dulles and CIA. I mean, they had their own grudges against him, but it's really where the power rests in this nation and the world that did not want someone like this, carrying on. And they foresaw, if he's going to go for 4 more years, and then what? His brother's going to be in here, potentially be in here for 8 years.
Right.
We're going to have to live with the Kennedys for 16 years. They'll totally remake America if that's the case. And we can't have that.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Conspirators. We're going to name names, baby. Oh, what the heck happened there? Let me get back up here. How did that happen? Hang on a second, everybody. I hit the wrong button here. So let me just come back here and get back into this. Yeah. I can't get this thing to go wide on me. I must have just taken down my what happened to it there, but we'll fix it. There we go. Like magic, huh? Okay. LBJ enlisted the help of key men whom he knew he could count on to assist him in this effort. Foremost among them were his henchmen, John Connally and Ed Clark. Connally, of course, is governor of Texas at this time, and Clark was his longtime attorney and campaign finance manager. Through Clark, LBJ was tapped the source of funds to finance his plan and the major expenses, not all, but the major expenses of the operation. And Clark just turned to Texas oilman H.L. Hunt, shown in the lower photograph here, and Clint Murkison in the above one. And this quote that I have here is from that lovely H.L. Hunt. There's no way left to get these traitors out of the government except by shooting them out. Anyway, the top levels of LBJ's secret task force would comprise other men who shared this disdain of JFK. it was imperative that all these men could be trusted to keep the secret. Now, the majority of them are CIA, who had experience and expertise in these matters. That is, the matters of killing heads of state who didn't cooperate. First and foremost among them is James Angleton, CIA's chief of counterintelligence. Isn't that a scary face there? He imagined himself a poet. And there's this gentleman here, Cord Meyer. He could have had a grudge because JFK was having a relationship with his wife. And there's this, I hesitate to call him a gentleman, this scallywag here, David Atlee Phillips. He was CIA's chief of Western Hemisphere operations, and he was headquartered in Mexico City. And then there is this lovely gentleman, William Harvey. He is CIA's Rome station chief. William Harvey's the one that's going to be bringing over all the marksmen from Europe, particularly France. These were Corsican marksmen. David Sanchez Morales, he was an assassin within the US CIA. And then there's this well-dressed character here, George Giannides, CIA operative. He's working with all the Cuban entities down in Florida and New Orleans. But in addition, we've got J. Edgar Hoover. He was going to be enlisted to help. Johnson knew that Hoover could be relied upon to handle the post-event phase and manage the investigation according to LBJ's direction. And then as with the CIA, the need to control the Secret Service would require only the actions of one man at the top. In this case, it's James Rowley, head of Secret Service, who was a good friend of both Johnson as well as his former boss, J. Edgar Hoover. Rowley knew the men in his agency whom he could trust to carry out his orders, which would all but abandon the president. That's essentially what we're going to see in Dallas. All the normal protection that would surround the president was removed. Going to leave him absolutely naked in Dallas. Also expected that certain men of Dallas police authorities would have to be called in. Jesse Curry, who was police chief, and his homicide investigator, Will Fritz, and Sheriff Bill Decker. That's Chief Curry up in the upper photograph and Bill Decker in the lower photograph there. And in case these men balked, it was a given that LBJ might need to make some phone calls, to close the deal. Other high-level government officials had been recruited one by one to handle key aspects of the plan. Various inducements had been applied, depending upon their individual weaknesses, just the way LBJ had done from the moment he was in Congress with Gene Latimer. He knew how to get to these people. He knew instinctively who could be trusted to know the broadest parts of the true mission. That number just had to be kept to a minimum. Everyone else farther down in the hierarchy, successively smaller span of knowledge of the entire plan would be maintained. Many were military, who were told to follow orders or suffer the consequences. These guys were told, you ever open your mouth about this, you will be court-martialed, and we'll come after you to the end of your days. Most would become unwitting participants simply because they were overtly forced or misled by a superior into taking an illegal or immoral action. Again, I refer back to LBJ's first hire when he went to Washington with Eugene Latimer. He knew he was doing wrong, but he would do it anyway. Let's look at the hit teams here. And there were teams. To ensure absolute confidence that the assassination of JFK would succeed, the plotters agreed early on that operational redundancy was the key. Too many things could go wrong with a single plan, even if there were multiple shooters from 2 or 3 directions. The men at the top, schooled in black bag operations, knew that it'd be necessary to run 3 parallel operations, each one nearly autonomous from the others. They would all be following the orders of a field commander who's going to be down there in Dealey Plaza or in the environment. And it was decided that they'd be set up in the following manner. First team would be deployed in the Texas School Book Depository, including the Patsy, the decoy assassin. And he would be served up to satisfy the public's need for a quick closure, In 12 hours, we would decide who did it, with plenty of phony evidence generously planted to support the frame-up. But he would be killed upon capture. They expected to kill Oswald in the Texas School Book Depository. Managed to get away. They expected, as we'll see, to get him on the bus. They went to there. They didn't get him in the bus. Then they expected to get him in the Texas Theater. They didn't get him there. Their last shot to get him was right at the police headquarters. Team 2 would consist of professional Corsican assassins. These are the ones that Bill Harvey brought over. These sharpshooters would be positioned on the grassy knoll at 2 separate locations there, at the south end of the triple overpass, which faced directly the oncoming traffic on Elm Street. And I must say, for some reason, these trees there look a little more overgrown. These trees weren't as grown up as they were at the time in '63. So I think this photograph comes from like the 70s, if not the 80s. But that vehicle that's positioned there makes me think it's even like the 80s there. This is more typical of the size of trees that were around Dealey Plaza at the time. Team 3 would be comprised of hitmen from the S-Force. You'll remember them, these guys that had been waiting in the wings. They would operate from buildings across Houston Street, both the Dow Tex building, that's that darker brick building in the center there, and then the County Records building, which is that light colored building to the right. And their shots would be relatively easy, and their locations would help assure their quick escape, as the attention of the few police officers on the scene would be focused on the first 2 locations, primarily the grassy knoll. But this brings up the question about Oswald. Before I do that, I'm going to mention right here, in today's show notes, I'm going to include a video of a lecture given by a former law enforcement officer. This is a gentleman named is Brian Edwards. Now, he served in law enforcement in Lawrence, Kansas. And he gives it's a lengthy discussion. And he goes into so much of the information that I'm just briefly presenting to you now. And you can choose to listen to that or not, or listen to it in parts, whatever you want to. But he goes into more detail about what I've just discussed right. But that'll be a link in the show notes. Brian Edwards. But this, of course, brings up, well, you, John, you've talked about the Patsy here. What about that? That's what the Warren Commission says. That's what major media is saying to us today. It was all Oswald. Well, Lee Harvey Oswald was a far more complex person than the lone nut characterization made by Hoover. And as I've indicated, it may come as a surprise, but there was more than one Oswald. And both of these Oswald took part in a deception program run by CIA since the early to mid-1950s. There was a Lee Oswald born in New Orleans, who enlisted at the Marines at age 17, and his mother was Marguerite Claverie Oswald, and she was the parent of a half-sibling named John Pict and his brother Robert Oswald. And then there is this gentleman here, who I'm going to call, for sake of keeping some clarity, Harvey Oswald, who was born in Europe and was fluent in the Russian language. And in the post-World War II environment, he was brought to the United States as a refugee by CIA as an orphan, and placed in the care of an imposter, Marguerite Oswald. So there's going to be a woman who's going to take on the name of Marguerite Oswald. And this is the Oswald that would defect to the USSR in 1959 under this CIA counterintelligence program. There were anywhere, depending upon who you're listening to, anywhere from 13 to 40 of these defectors that were sent behind the Iron Curtain this time. In the Marine Corps, Lee Oswald served as a radio specialist with a top secret security clearance. And among his duties, he served at the U.S. Air Force Base in Atsugi, in Japan, specifically in the CIA's area of the base that was tasked with the U-2 surveillance flights over China and Soviet Union. This was the largest CIA station out of Langley, Virginia. Harvey Oswald also joined the Marines, and he had a similar but different tour of training and deployment. So they were two guys, the Lee and the Harvey were shadowing each other. This is by intention. As I say right here, the two Oswalds closely mirrored one another. In 1959, the Harvey Oswald requested and received an early discharge from the Marines. Ostensibly, he wanted to join his mother, the imposter Marguerite, in New Orleans after she had an on-the-job accident. She was working part-time in a candy store, and a jar of candy fell off a shelf and hit her in the head, and she said, "I need my boy home here to help me." So he got out of the Marines, but no sooner had this request been granted than Harvey said, "I'm going off to the Soviet Union, and I'm taking all my U-2 and radar information with me." Well, in 1962, with the defector program, and this is the defector program of the counterintelligence chief, James Angleton, had put in place, it proved to be a bust. We sent, however many people behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviets knew all these were sleeper agents, and they sent them out to remote locations. In the case of Harvey Oswald, he wasn't sticking around. They weren't going to keep him in Moscow. They sent him out to Minsk in Belarus. Anyway, Angleton called all these guys back because they weren't getting anything done, and they realized the Soviets had figured it out. But Harvey Oswald refused to come back. He stuck it out over there because he had an agenda of his own. He aspired to be a writer, and he was over there collecting information that he would use to write a book when he came back. But come early 1962, April of 1962, Angleton says, "You get back over here, and you get back over here now." And so he did. And with an expedited passport and with money loaned to him by the U.S. State Department, Harvey Oswald returned, and he brought with him a wife and a young child. And they settled in Fort Worth. Well, it seems evident by this time that the CIA had considered another use for Harvey other than being a defector. In Fort Worth, Harvey Oswald was befriended by this gentleman we see in the photograph here, George de Mohrenschildt, ostensibly an oil executive at direction of CIA's Dallas station chief. Now, de Mohrenschildt, he's a very sophisticated double agent. He'd been an agent for the Nazis until he said, "Hey, I can work for you guys too." So he began working for the CIA, first as the Office of Special Services, the OSS, and then as it transitioned into the CIA. And this is something that you'll take note of right here. He coincidentally had a close relationship with the First Lady's family. By that I mean the Boiviers. He came over here to the States, and he was trying to hook up with a wealthy widow. And Jackie and her sister Lee, their mother was looking for someone to hook up with as well. And For a while there, they knew him as Uncle George. In fact, he used to bounce Jackie on his knee. How's that for a coincidence, huh? Well, the likelihood of de Mohrenschildt ever linking up with Lee Oswald or Harvey Oswald is, pretty remote, but this was the order that he was given to become Oswald's CIA handler once he arrived in Fort Worth. And de Mohrenschildt said, why don't you move from Fort Worth to Dallas? It'd be a little easier for me to stay in touch with you here. And in Dallas, de Mohrenschildt introduced Oswald and his wife Marina to a community of white Russians. Now, if you don't know what white Russians are, these are people who are former czarists who are looking to restore Russia to the czar's regime again. These are not commies. So that's who Oswald was hanging out with in Dallas. And through de Mohrenschildt, you'll love this, he got Oswald employment in Dallas with the Jaggers Childs Stovall, a graphics art company that performed classified work for the government. You'll remember, perhaps from last week when I was showing images of the U-2, or the 2 weeks ago when I was showing images of the U-2 overflights, all those little labels that are put on those photographs are done by the Jaggers Childs Stovall company here. They are a CIA contract organization. And guess who got work there? Our little defector to the Soviet Union. Anyway, he'd been back about a year now. It's now April of '63, and Harvey Oswald suddenly moves from Dallas to New Orleans. Apparently his CIA overlord, James Angleton, had decided that Harvey Oswald needed to strengthen his pro-communist bona fides. And at this time, the Lee Oswald is beginning to emerge in Dallas. So in late April, Harvey Oswald went to New Orleans, where he proceeded to make contact with a number of people, none of them communists, nor friends of Cuba or the Soviet Union. And in fact, he managed to find a job at the Riley Coffee Company, owned by a determined anti-communist. And in fact, the owner of this company, Mr. Riley here, he was in concert with a number of long-standing New Orleans family, very conservative families, wealthy families that go back to the end of the Civil War kind of situation. And they managed to get Oswald working in this factory here, howbeit for a short period of time. In addition to working at the Riley Coffee Company and its owner, who had long associations with the CIA, it was located at the center of the U.S. intelligence community in New Orleans. The offices are a stone's throw from one another. CIA, FBI, ONI, and Secret Service. And one of their other neighbors is this gentleman here, Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent who was running we'll call it a detective agency, huh? But as I like to say, nobody is ever former CIA or former FBI. Bannister had close relationships with CIA assets in New Orleans. These two gentlemen here, who you may have heard of in the past, David Ferry and Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw is the gentleman, along with David Ferry, who Jim Garrison will try and prosecute in 1967, 68, for their association with the murder of the president. These three men were violently anti-Castro and anti-Kennedy. And under their guidance, Harvey Oswald took on the role of being pro-Castro, even to the extent of forming a local branch of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. What a charade that was. He had written back to the New York main office and said, I'd like to open a branch down in New Orleans. They said, forget it. There's nobody down there to join it. And he said, well, I'll open it up and I'll be its own member. So Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New Orleans. And here he is passing out leaflets in support of the committee. And he's doing this in such a noticeable and obviously staged manner. In fact, the newspapers, they said, the news media was said, hey, there's a rabble rouser down there. Well, you know, as someone said, in New Orleans, there's a rabble rouser on every corner. But the news media showed up for this guy because that's what they were told to do. He even got into a squabble with an famous anti-Castro activist. That was also captured on camera. As he had defected, as when he had defected to the USSR, Oswald is playing a role, and he's playing it to perfection. Again, this is the Harvey Oswald. In September, all of a sudden, he's relocating back to Texas. Apparently, he had achieved whatever he was to do in New Orleans and was now required to be back in Dallas. And de Mohrenschildt handed off his responsibility to this lovely couple here, this CIA assets, Ruth and Michael Payne. Now, I could take almost 6 hours to talk about this lovely couple, but we don't have that time here. But if you look on your own, you'll learn about Ruth and Michael Payne. They become the new CIA handlers for Harvey Oswald. Anyway, it's in October that Ruth Payne secures a job for Harvey at the book depository, coincidentally, a building owned by one of LBJ's friends, oilman D.H. Byrd. But unknown to Harvey Oswald, he had now been successfully set up to be the patsy, and he's going to be in the location when it all goes down, and there will be assistance coming from the Lee Oswald. And as I will show you in upcoming episodes, how Lee Oswald is in the building with him at the same time. So that'll conclude a presentation for today. And let me come off of this share here and address any questions that you have. I know it's a lot to observe, you know, both about these conspirators and about the two Oswalds.
Okay, this is Lori. You just said at the very, very end that Ruth Payne was in the building at the time.
Oh,
Is
no,
that what you said?
No. The Lee Oswald will be in the book depository. Ruth Payne got him the job
Yes.
in the book depository a month before. He'd only been working there for about 4 weeks as a stock boy.
Okay, and Lee was in the building.
Lee was in the building, yeah. And I'll go over that at the same time on November 22nd. Yeah. I don't want to get ahead of myself about that because
it's okay.
It's a fascinating story, Lori, about how, you know, what Lee was doing in the building that day.
Okay.
All right. John, this is Kathy.
Hey, Kathy.
So did Lee and Harvey know of each other?
Yes, they do. The families,
from the get-go, or from as a
over time, because not all, the one person in there who refused to deal with this is the half-brother John Pitt, P-I-C-T. But Robert, you know, here's one thing. Right, and you know, because the Oswalds were almost as complicit with this as Lee were in incriminating their family member. The first meeting of the Warren Commission, they brought in Marina Oswald, Marie. I'm blanking on his mother's name. And his brother Marguerite. They brought in Marina, Marguerite, and Robert, and all of them said, yes, this is something that we believe in right here. And you know, they just helped to, you know, give away their brother.
Were they taken care of?
To go, to tell the story of the two Oswalds is a very detailed and complex story that has been researched by John Armstrong. He's one of the people on your source books like there. But there's so to really tell that story, it's almost like a 10 to 12-hour course in itself, because it's over a long period of time, because this began in the early 50s when they were, and even before that, because the groundwork was being set in even in the 40s, and then it played out right through the assassination on November 22nd. And I won't tell you today, but I will tell you at the end here what happened to the Lee Oswald.
As a follow-up to that, John,
Mhm.
do you think that the family of of Harvey or Lee, whichever one, was taken care of financially,
And otherwise.
enumerated in some way by
Um, Marina Oswald received so much money from private contributions, and over time, that she never was in one. And she, with Harvey Oswald, she had two daughters, and these are grown women today. Marina Oswald is still alive today, as are her two daughters. In the aftermath of the killing here, there was tremendous outpouring of sympathy toward her, and money was just mailed in envelope. People would, I mean, we wouldn't do this today. We would have a what do we call it? We would do it
GoFundMe page.
they'd have a GoFundMe page, but at this time, people would just stuff cash in an envelope and put on here, Marina Oswald, Dallas, Texas, and that money would get to her somehow.
The other thing I was thinking of is that over the holidays, we were kind of talking about this, and a friend of ours had said that she had seen a Secret Service agent that had been at the scene of the assassination, and he was obviously in his 80s or so, and his comment was, all this is all conspiracy theories. I was there. I know what happened. And Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and everything that has been reported is the truth. So I assume there were those that were in the know, and then there were those that were
Out of the know.
out of the know.
Yeah. Well, I think that your friend, I'm not sure, but I'll presume they was referring to Paul Landis, the recent Secret Service agent who's approaching 90 years old.
Oh, okay.
Recently published this book, who claims that he was tasked with cleaning out the limousine, and in doing so, he found a bullet, and he took it inside and left it on a stretcher. And then the larger part of his story is, it was so horrifying to me that I couldn't speak about it for these many decades until I'm about to die, and now I've written a book. Well, let me deal with that subject in one of the upcoming episodes, because I'm going to present a contrary story by a similar story, but by another agent named Sam Kinney. Sam Kinney originally created the story of, I was tasked with cleaning out the limousine, and I found the bullet, and I put it on the stretcher. Sam Kinney passed away in '97, and the person who brought that to the public's attention is a guy named Gary Lukes, and he passed away at the beginning of this year. So that just opened the field up for Paul Landis to say, hey, there's no one out there to contest my story, so I'm going to bring it forward. And the person who was assisting Paul Landis in this is a guy named James Robinall. Now, I don't want to talk about James Robinall today, because that's a big story. I'll deal with that down the road here. But here we are at the 60. People bring out pieces like the same way I'm bringing this course out right now, because it's an anniversary year. It's on people's mind. You can't bring out a Kennedy book unless you're offering something new. Publishers just don't want it. But if you have something new, so much of what Paul Landis has in his book is a rehash of things that have already been told, or his detailing of how he was because he was a very young agent, and he'd been tasked with looking after the grandchildren of Eisenhower. And then with the Kennedys coming in, he was tasked with looking after Carolyn and John. And so he was brought really to Dallas as a last minute choice because so many of the more long-term agents had recently resigned. So Paul came in and he was on the Queen Mary, as we'll talk about next week. Now that's a long answer to your question there, Cassie.
I have a question. This is Penny. I have a
Go ahead, Penny.
question.
Go ahead, Penny.
Does Marina Oswald or her two daughters, do they go by their original name now, or did they change their name?
Penny, I don't know. I don't. I think Marina Oswald remarried. She may have remarried twice. I'll put this politely. She was a pretty active girl after Harvey. Okay.
Okay.
And she had a lot of relationships. And so where she ended up at, I know she remarried. She divorced that husband. She may have remarried, but I can't say with certainty about that. So what her name today is, I'm not sure. It wouldn't be too hard to find out. But as she would say to anybody who was doing, researching this, she'd say, don't waste your time. Go live your life. I'll say this about Marina was working on behalf of the KGB. Her uncle was a major officer in the KGB. She was tasked with getting close to Oswald, hooked up with him in Minsk. They married quickly, got pregnant, brought her over here. And as happened to a number of these defectors, they got over there and they got trapped. I wouldn't say trapped. James Angleton would say they were trapped into marriages. They brought these women back with them. They quickly got into a domestic dispute. The wives divorced, and then they had these KGB agents floating around the state here. So Angleton said to all these new defectors, if you go over there and bring a wife back with you, you're staying with her. You're not going to get divorced.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right.
I was going to mention something not on this topic, but
Go ahead,
from
George.
earlier. I guess CNN ran an interview or a special during Thanksgiving week about Lady Bird and her book, perhaps, and what a wonderful man LBJ was, and absolutely none of
what a
is
saint.
being said that he would. None of that is true. He was a loving, wonderful man, and I tried to find it, but I couldn't. I don't know. Maybe it'd be on YouTube by now.
They must have sold out. They've sold out. Everybody just wants to hear that story. She was an enabler. LBJ was a sexual predator. As much of a sexual addict JFK was, LBJ quadrupled him. And Lady Bird knew of all this, and she was an enabler of his behavior. And so she can tell whatever story she wants to tell. It's all just cover, for posterity. But the real story, among other people that knew the story, it's out there, albeit in various other texts right there. But because I haven't talked about the sexuality of either of these men, I hesitate to bring it in, except as in Q&A here that we do here.
Real.
I'll tell you. I will tell you this though, Laura.
Oh, come on.
I'll tell you this. I'll tell you one thing here. LBJ.
Don't hold back.
When he, of course, LBJ. Because he would, because he used to tap the secretarial pool. So he'd have a secretary come up, and a la Clinton, it would either be oral sex or it would be vaginal sex. And one day, Lady Bird walked in on him. It was in that little powder room off the Oval Office, and Lady Bird walked in on him. And of course, contretemps. And afterwards, LBJ went to the secret. You install me a buzzer in this room, okay? So when Lady Bird is on the move, you buzz me, okay? And that's what they did. So LBJ would have a warning system. It was the Lady Bird warning system. All right, I don't know that's I didn't mean to go off on all that stuff here, but anybody else? You know, we're really talking about the conspirators here. And as I said, I will put this in today's show notes because I think you'll find it interesting. It is long. It is long. It's almost 3 hours. But this gentleman, Brian Edwards, an experienced law enforcement officer who served in the Lawrence Police Department's counter sniper division. This is a guy that is tasked to take out snipers when a VIP comes to town. He knows, he lays out what it would have taken to hold this operation here. And so it's worth listening to, but he talks about a number of other aspects of the conspiracy that I think you will find interesting, the details of how this really could work. And you can listen to it in total or in part, depending upon your time for it.
John, one other question you bring up.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
The people, the gentleman who was out, who was an anti-sniper.
Mhm.
You know, they had the trestle, the railroad bridge behind that. Do you get into any of that? Where they
I will mention it, but Brian will go into detail right there. He thinks that there is, and he will show in his speech, he will designate where he thinks all of the locations are at, both in the 3 buildings. I'm speaking of the depository, the Daltex building, and the Hall of Records. 2 locations on the grassy knoll, and 1 location on the triple overpass at the south end right there. And I know other people that think that as well. The surprising thing is that there were so many people. There were railroad workers on the opposite end of that railroad overpass, the triple overpass right there. Those people, one in particular, his name is S.E. Holland, Sam Holland. He saw the gunsmoke coming out from among the trees, and he and his railroad workers went in behind there to try and chase down the gunman. And by the time they got there, they missed it. And he tried to give testimony, and nobody wanted to hear it, and not included in any of the Warren Commission whatsoever. Another railroad worker is working in a railroad, 2-story railroad building directly behind the picket fence, named Lee Holland, and he also saw the firing. He saw 2 men with a gunman break the rifle down into 2 pieces, hand it to another, into a railroad bag, and then stuffed into a railroad utility box, and off they went. So, but they, again, the Warren Commission did not want to hear from people who saw something other than Lee Harvey Oswald.
did you talk about the manhole covers or the drains, the storm drains there?
He will talk about it. He does not give it any credence because, you know, he says shooting from, first of all, these were they were too small and at such a low angle. He said, when you're a sniper, you need to be at a high angle, not from a low angle. So he will address that. He considers that a bogus story. He also refers to the fact that he's a very small and he's a big man. He said, if I was tasked to go down there, I'd say no, thank you.
But it's good for consumer, but that's all right. I'm just
Yeah, but he's fascinating to listen to because he's such a knowledgeable person about this subject.
right.
Anybody
I have a
else?
question.
Go ahead.
Okay, how realistic is it that anybody would find supposedly the bullet that killed JFK in that car? Because didn't it blow the back of his brain out? They didn't find any remnants of it in his brain. Wouldn't it have gone clear through?
Well, there were a lot of bullets and bullet fragments that were being fired at the president, some of which hit part of the vehicle and splintered and were found as fragments within the vehicle when it was illegally cleaned under the orders of LBJ to the Secret Service. There was also, let's hold that the part of that answer until episode 6, Barbara, because I will address specifically the Sam Kinney story, which is in contrast to the most recent Paul Landis story about finding a whole bullet. That's what Sam Kinney said. I found this whole bullet. I walked in, I couldn't find anybody, so I put it on the stretcher that I thought it should be on. Why he did that, you know, these are all law enforcement people. They know how to handle evidence, and none of them are behaving like law enforcement people. They're acting like stupid people. And they all recognize that the cleaning of the limousine is destruction of evidence, that taking any evidence out of
Right.
there and handling it is so inappropriate for establishing chain of custody. And if you and I were to do it, that's one thing. But law enforcement people are trained how to handle evidence, and none of them are acting as they should on this day. They're all acting in contrary.
Maybe it's one that
Proper
hit John
protocol.
Connolly.
Okay, so Butch just said maybe it was one that hit John Connolly, but there's never any, at least of anything that I've seen, where they discuss John Connolly's being hit, number one, and number two, he's JFK's buddy. What a what a slam.
What do you mean LBJ's buddy? We'll get into that.
LBJ.
I mean,
He's
LBJ's, yeah,
Oh,
buddy.
I don't want to get ahead of the story there, Barbara, because I'll deal with that
Okay,
next week right there, because we'll be all
Okay.
of that part of it. But
okay.
And
All
let's
right.
and we'll hold a little bit of that to episode 6, because we will look at the limousine and all the evidence that was available in the limousine and how all of that went away.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Anything else? Well, thanks for being so engaged with this, and if your questions are good ones, they certainly bring up some of my additional knowledge about the subject here. And as I said, I'll send some show notes and they'll accompany the recording today. And I hope that we're able to get last week's recording off at the same time, so you'll be able to, if you want to review any of this material as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you, John.